welcome to another edition of Reinventing School. Today we are focused on the role of the state. Very often we hear that state government requires this, or that the schools can't operate without checking with the state or similar things. And I can't say that I understand that very clearly. So why not invite a few folks who actually do understand it pretty clearly? So we have three representatives from three different states, and perhaps a fourth that will join us about halfway through the show from Kentucky. But Randy, Pender, Heather, could you please introduce yourselves? And Randy, you'll have to unmute in that process.
I'll jump in. I'm Randy Watson, Commissioner of Education for Kansas, and happy to be here with you today, Aaron.
Very good. Thank you, Pender.
Yes, hi, I'm Pender MAKIN. I'm Commissioner of Education for the state of Maine.
Good. And Heather?
Good afternoon. I'm also delighted to be here. My name is Heather Bouchez. I'm Deputy Secretary for the Vermont Agency of Education.
Very good. Thank you. So I'm assuming, and I want one of you at least to stop me when I'm wrong, that every state in the United States has a Secretary of Education or a Commissioner of Education or a Superintendent of Education, but basically a boss of education. And I'm also guessing that most states, maybe all states, have more than one school district, so that there's a local governance component in this. And there's also a federal component in here too, because we know that, for example, Betsy DeVos is the Secretary of Education for the United States. I'm not sure that it goes further. I don't think there's anybody in charge of the world, but maybe there is, and we'll learn about that as well. If we go down to the school level, we've got the principal who sort of reports to a school board, but also reports to parents. We have teachers, and then we have students. And I think that more or less is the food chain. And I think it's more or less similar in every state in the country. Now, tell me what I did wrong, please. Randy, Pender?
So there's a superintendent probably, and maybe some regional superintendents, depending on the region, that'll be in there between a principal and school board. And Hawaii is a state that is also a school district. It's one school district and a state commissioner. So it's all in one. So that it would be the exception of everything else you said, Howard. But I believe everything else is pretty good. I'll let Heather and Pender chime in.
Sorry, Randy. I would just add, I don't think, at least in Vermont, the principals report to the school board or have an awful lot to do with the school board. It really is the superintendent in Vermont. And the principals report to and are most closely supervised, of course, by the superintendents.
Okay. And Pender, you have to unmute. You just leave yourselves unmuted. It's better.
Yeah. I had some phone situations going on. I was trying to spare you. Yeah, in Maine it's the same thing. We our school boards have one employee only, and that is the superintendent of schools, and they hire the principals who report to them.
Okay, so if I was a fifth grader and I wanted to keep it really simple, Pender, would I say that you're the boss? You're like the boss of my school?
No.
Okay.
No,
explain
you
why
wouldn't
not.
probably say that.
How would you explain it to a fifth grader? What is it that you do?
I run the agency that supports the schools. The boss of your school is the principal, is what I would say to the fifth grader. And the boss of your classroom, maybe is the teacher, or the kids are, for that matter. But yeah, my role, and we've redefined in Maine, we've redefined our state Department of Education a little bit. For a while, it was viewed as the mandate and compliance monitor and check to see if people got it right kind of an organization. And we are out to re-professionalize education and to reinvigorate that, so that educators remember that they are creators of wonderful experiences for kids, and leaders can let go of just the management piece and become visionary leaders who use their professional judgment. And we, the Department of Education in Maine, we're just here to serve. So how do we move barriers, provide resources, information, and guidance? And if we could do that and reinvigorate the field, who need to be the closest to the work and the most deeply connected and passionate about it, we're going to see better outcomes for kids.
Well, what you're describing is very much like what Andreas Schleicher talked about at the EdPalooza conference. So Andreas runs the department of more or less education research for the OECD and knows probably more about international education than most people on earth. And what he prescribed, if you will, and actually has a new book that I just found out about called World Class, is very much like what you're describing. But I have a feeling you're more the exception than the rule. And I know, Randy, you, because we met one of the teachers of the year in a past episode, and he or she, I'm trying to remember, I don't remember, was kind enough to say that you are way ahead of the curve and that you are working very hard to reinvent school. So give us a sense of how similar what you're doing looks to what Pender is describing, or whether you're a step or two behind or way ahead.
Well, I think I'd say we're mirror what Pender's discussing. I think historically, schools have perceived state agencies as bureaucratic and compliance, and Pender articulated that extremely well. I'm a school guy. I still think of myself as a school teacher, or maybe a principal. My wife's still an elementary principal. My daughter's a teacher in our state. So it's really about, we're trying to set policy at a very high level to drive complex behavior in a school. And that's an inverse relationship, Howard. The more complex I get, the more simple they get, if that makes sense. So No Child Left Behind is a great example. Great goal. We want every kid to read and do math, right? At grade level. But when you make that the only policy at a federal level, you drive then a test prep mentality at a low level at the exclusion of some other things. So we're trying to balance that out of what is the student success. And then we're trying to say, look, student success is complicated. It's made up of academic skills and social emotional skills and some civic engagement skills, et cetera. How should we measure that? That's done in collaboration with people in the state. Now, we're going to hold you accountable to those, and we're going to give you great support and guidance, but you're going to get complex in your community about how to go get those things done. So we try to invert the process a little bit.
So simple is on the state side and complex is on the teacher side, yes?
We really try to make that our internally our motto, because the more complex I think we make it, the more simple they will attack that. Teaching and learning is a complex behavior. It involves many different moving parts of arts and science. It's been well researched and written about. We can't think we can drive every bit of that at a state level or a federal level, in my opinion. We have to drive policy that enables, as Pender articulated, local people to have the creativity and the drive to go achieve those outcomes in multiple ways.
Heather, how does it play out in your state?
Yeah,
and Vermont is always a very different state from everybody all the time anyway. So yeah.
Yes, we're very proud of those unique differences in Vermont.
You guys were a country at one point, right?
We, yes, in our history, we attempted to secede.
Okay.
I think that we were convinced otherwise.
I think before the colonies, I think you guys were added to the colonies.
We were part of New York, the New York colony.
New York. Thank you.
Okay. And I'm saying we, I must actually preface by saying only in this household would my daughter be able to say we, because I am simply a low flatlander since I was born in New York State.
Ah, got it.
That's a I actually wanted to point out that one of the neat things about this panel is that you've really gotten a great pulse on rural education. So we're all in schools that are heavily rural, and I don't know if that was by design or not, but
it was by design.
Great.
Yeah.
What I wanted to actually echo, in addition to my colleagues who I hardly agree with, is for us in Vermont, and it is actually linked with some of these very, centuries old practices. We have some very interesting local control issues. Every state has to deal with local control, and I think Randy was getting at that, which is, look, at the state, we kind of have these higher order principles, we have these high level policies, we have standards. I know you talked about that in one of your other discussions. What is really critical, and then we kind of, leave it at the local level to implement that. For us, we are actually taking a bit of a different tack than what Pender was mentioning, which is we're really focusing on the state has a responsibility to ensure equity across the state. We need to ensure that all students have equitable access to rich opportunities, to the learning experiences that they need to actually be successful. And all of us as states are very invested in that. So I don't want to give the impression that others are not. But for us, what we've come to learn is that this local control piece really is at odds with equity. And so there's really a tension and a balance there. And so we are actually really focused on providing leadership, support, oversight at the school district level, so that that's where we can actually have a bit more of the systematizing effect. So if we can get all of our districts actually functioning similarly, and holding them accountable for what's happening in their schools versus the agency directly interfacing with the schools, that's one of the pieces that we think is going to be really useful moving forward.
Who controls the money? Where does the money for a local district or a local school come from? And I'm asking that, I want to provide a little bit of context. So I've been doing a lot of writing to try to understand, writing and research to try to understand how so many pieces of school works and why we're so uninvolved, for example, with exercise or a higher level of cultural, social, emotional learning and global citizenship and public health and all those things that are probably every bit as important as anything else that we learn in school. So one of the things that we're looking at is the economics of West Virginia in comparison with the economics of New York State. Just pick two. New York is certainly not the big winner in, best education system or best by almost any measure. They're about in the middle. West Virginia is pretty low. And it was very obvious to me that the combination of income tax, sales tax, and property tax, right, drive those numbers for West Virginia. So it's a little difficult to get out of that. And the kids, because I've been to West Virginia interviewing kids for another project called Kids on Earth, and the kids are well aware of that. So when I talk to any kid who sees his future, her future, clearly, like, the smartest thing we can do is leave. So that's not going to help, but there we are. You're in a situation, each of you, where I think that between the three of you, the largest city is probably Wichita. And I'm guessing that just makes the top 50 metro areas. Do I have that about right? So
Yes.
So you have a lot of smaller population areas, right? How does that fit together? Do you have enough money? Can I write you a check? I mean, just tell me, how does the money work? And what's the state's role in that? Because it seems to me that a lot of the money comes from the state, but maybe I'm wrong.
Well, I can tell you in Maine, it's baked into our constitution. So we have a line that's different from Vermont's, actually, that says the several municipalities shall make provision. I think it's adequate provision for the education of the students. And I think Vermont says the state shall make provision, I believe.
Yeah.
And everybody's got a different one. So originally, Maine was supposed to locally fund and run all of their various little school districts. And, over time that has changed. And at this point, we, at the State Department of Education, we're supposed to fund 55% of the total cost of education in the state.
Does that K-12 or is that K plus college?
Pre-K through 12.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So we are supposed to be at a 55% funding target. We're about 51% right now, and we're trying to move 1% further each year till we hit the 55%.
So what's 100%? Just is that a $10,000 number?
Figure?
Yeah. About.
Well, so 100% is about 2.4 billion in Maine.
So per kid?
Oh, no, per kid. An average per kid might be around $11,000 or $12,000
Okay.
per year.
Good. Do you, Randy or Heather, do you have a sense of your per kid average, just so we can kind of compare apples and apples?
Howard, that gets really hard. We even debate that in Kansas because we start off, our state constitution says the state shall provide equitable, suitable finance, and that's been litigated a lot. But so we have a base that's just under $6,000, and then we have weightings that go on to the base, and then we have equalization related to capital expenditures. And then we have some local control, as Pender described, only ours is much, much smaller. So if you combine all of those, you're going to get somewhere in the $12,000 to $15,000 range, depending on the size of the school district.
Which is almost double West Virginia. That's a lot of money. That's pretty good money. Heather, how about you?
So as my good friend and colleague Pender mentioned, we have things a little different in Vermont.
How many times a week do you say that sentence? We have
Well, we have a very complex system given how tiny our state is. So we have, you know, somewhere depending on the year between 240 or 250 schools. We have 53 what we would all call districts. And the levels of complexity that we have are pretty mind-boggling given that. I mean, our entire population of students is about 77,000. That's actually smaller than some of our urban school districts alone. But regarding this issue, so we actually have a somewhat recent, in the past 20 years, funding formula that really is almost like a combo of Maine and Kansas, because we actually use weights and come up with what's called an equalized pupil count for let's just say each district. And what that does is actually dictates sort of like how low or high. The tax rate is equal across the state, so that's important to say right there. And that's why we have this equalized pupil, because then that actually dictates what the local budget within parameters should be. But then we also have the added layer that for some of our communities, fine, no problem. We will pass this budget. We don't have a problem with it. For others, they have to go 3, 4, 5 times. So even though they all have the same tax rate, it's not as equitable as we might like.
Okay.
Because that's really where this was supposed to come from. It was supposed to come from just what you talked about earlier, that students should not be penalized, right? The same tax rate should occur across the state, so that the haves are not getting more, and the have-nots are not having access to the same at least dollar figure. So it's complex, and we don't award sort of, you know, buckets of money like some other states do. Like it isn't that way.
So if
Howard,
yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I liken it back when you talk about the property tax issue, as you were talking about in West Virginia. That's really Jonathan Kozol's historic book of Savage Inequalities, where he talks about the difference right across the river, right? And that's why most states since that time have tried to get away from that and have more of a state base that allows some flexibility at the local level to go above that base. But once you start getting outside of locally doing it a lot, the inequities start to really grow, because your high social economic areas, like for us, Johnson County, which is the large metro of Kansas City. So Kansas City, Kansas is fairly wealthy, very wealthy compared to Kansas City, Missouri. And that in that metro area. And if you allowed them to just use their ability to tax themselves, they would have a phenomenal, they would go way above. So the state limits that and says, here's a base, and you can, in Kansas, you can go to 30%. States limit that because really of what Jonathan wrote about years ago, that local property tax drives horrible inequities in poor versus wealthy areas.
So how do we make that better? Because West Virginia is still sitting at number 48 or 47 or whatever that is, and Massachusetts, it's sitting at number 1. So the obvious question I'm getting to be a fifth grader is, why don't some of the people in Massachusetts give the people in West Virginia money, right? I mean, which is the oversimplification, but that's the fundamental question of government, right? How do you make it equitable? So how do you make it equitable? How do you make it equitable across districts in your own state? And also, how do you make it equitable state to state? Is there a way to do that?
I certainly want Pender and Heather to weigh in. I just want to give you, as you've alluded to, Howard, the historical perspective is what challenges all of us, which was we all started with one-room schoolhouses built on sections of land governed locally, taxed locally in order to have a local school. And that spread when the ordinances of 1785 and 1787 spread the grid system across the United States. We spread that, and then we found out over time we've got these inequities, which comes back to local control versus state. I'll let them talk, but unraveling those not only decades, centuries old ways in which we conducted schooling and funding of schooling proves to be difficult, especially in areas where they're high affluent areas that want a really top-notch education.
And I'm guessing gender and race fit into this puzzle somewhere too, right? So Pender, Heather, you want to jump in?
Well, I can say Maine, I know that Heather has a bizarre formula, and I would go so far as to say Maine is even more so. It is the most convoluted school funding formula you could ever imagine, and it is so because we have this team of researchers who study each component of the formula every year. And there is so much effort that goes into impacting equity, but it's not happening. So it's still extraordinarily inequitable in our state. So, and it's based on property taxes, and it's the local community's perceived ability to pay. And they have studied income tax. They have studied, other possible the census, which maybe we'll have new census data, but the census data to determine. But at the end of the day, Maine settled about 14 years ago on the idea that property tax would be the driver of how much a community could pay toward the total cost of education, which is figured through the formula. And it is it's called the Essential Programs and Services formula. In other words, for one student or for 15 kids, you would need this, amount of staff and this much stuff, and this is how much it'll cost. But it is nowhere near meeting what essential programs and services do actually cost. And so it's a misnomer, it's confusing, and most districts in our state fund well above that minimum that they have to chip in and that we match with state money. And those communities who can, they do more. And there are very few communities in our state who don't do more. And in some cases, it's double. In some cases, children are funded double.
So here's the very confusing part. This is going to come back around to literacy. It's going to come back around to career opportunities. It's going to come back around to whether you're obese or not and whether you have type 2 diabetes and all of those issues. And they all seem to wander back in and through the question of, well, how was school? And then what's happened since as a result of school. So indeed, if we all buy into the idea, I think we do, that what we're doing now in school is basically creating an economy for 30 years from now, a local economy. So how much do you think about that? And the specific I want to get to is, how secure are we that we're doing it right? So Heather, you want to jump in?
I didn't hear the very last part of your question.
How secure do we feel that we're doing it right? Big stakes game.
Yeah. Well, I'm very proud of some of the work that we've done in Vermont to align our workforce needs with what is happening in the education system, which might be coming at it a little bit differently than how you originally posed the question. So I think we have been really focused on expanding and leveraging career technical education to have hopefully a direct impact on our economy. So really trying to align what is the actual, what are the programs, what is the actual curriculum that students are learning, at our regional career and technical education centers, with input from our business leaders across the state to really support that and actually sort of give the blessing of, yes, we agree, this is the important principles, the kinds of materials that we need our students to actually, we need Vermont students to master, so that
All right. So that's
contribute.
that's the economic argument, right? More
Yep.
or less. But how much am I paying into the pool so that Vermont has a school system? But I'm putting in about 8% or something at a federal level, a little more than that. Some number like that, right? As a taxpayer. What's the federal contribution to education? Let's call it 10%. It's something like that, above or below. As much as I want the kids in Vermont to succeed and to end up with successful careers, that's not why I'm giving you my money. I'm giving you my money because they're going to vote. So do all the career education you want to. I need citizens who can make good decisions. That's what I'm willing to pay for. That's what I want my tax money to go. So what does that side look like? Because that's a longer view.
I guess no one else is jumping in, so I guess I'll answer and then leave some time for my colleagues to respond. I guess I don't see those as in opposition. So I don't. Yes, I might have framed it around what the economic needs are for Vermont, but we're also teaching our students about civics and engagement, and those are things that both our business sectors would value, and then also I would assume, at a national level would be critical. It's also interesting though, because I would say, just as an interesting sort of point, the bulk of our education funding is state funding. And so we do get some federal funds, but the bulk is from state taxes. And so that really raises the point of, who's the boss then on this?
Yeah, right. Exactly. That was why I kind of started there. Randy, what are you thinking?
Well, I think we're doing a horrible job of matching out student outcome to student. So Howard, you hit on what we're trying to do in Kansas. You said, how much do we think about that success as an adult? That's all I think about. What is a successful adult? And when you ask that question I would argue anywhere in the United States, but I ask it a lot in Kansas to anyone that'll listen, in a very red state, right? There's nothing blue or purple about us. So other than Lawrence, which would be a little bit, but I mean, in a very red state, people will describe to you what make up success, and then what we measure and how we go about every day of school, there's a total mismatch in that. But when you go about changing that, at least in a red state, people locally don't want that changed if they were successful, because they want school to be played like they played it. And that's the rub. They describe something that they want, which isn't what they really want in schools. Creativity, problem solving, teamwork, collaboration, working on task management where you manage projects and you go deep into learning. And then when you talk about that, no, I need to have a good ACT score to get into the college that I want, or I need to buy my way into the college that I want, right? It's all about playing this game. And if I play it well, I'll get to go to Brown and I'll get a great education, and then I'll do fine later on and I'll figure out these other skills. And yet, as I mentioned, when I ask from the business leader of the largest businesses, Boeing to farmers, they will describe a different skill set than they really want when it comes time to their own sons or daughters. I don't know if that's true in every state, but it's certainly true in Kansas.
Is it true in other
I
states?
do know.
Right. Yeah.
Oh, it is, of course. And I think what has happened, and this is something we feel like we can change a little bit in Maine, but that there's this data craving in our society where something has to be able to be dissected granularly so they can be easily measured, preferably on a 1 to 4 scale, and then plotted on a nice graph. And over the past 20 years, when the business model was applied to education, by which I mean you took pre-motivated humans who came into this ready to do great work and said, hey, your scores are going to be compared, and you're going to be an A or an F, and you're going to be a failing school And we're going to look at it according to these test scores, starting with No Child Left Behind, the outcomes-based methodology. What happened is everything that is deeply important but very challenging to measure or impossible to measure on a 1 to 4 scale had to be set aside because states were chasing down these easy to measure skills. And I think it has completely narrowed curriculum nationwide. It has turned the eyes of our nation away from public education. I mean, it's just, there used to be, when I first became a teacher, I put teacher on an application for an apartment that I was hoping to get. And I thought, I'm going to get this apartment. I'm a teacher. I'm like one of the best humans on the planet. People really respected education, and educators felt like real practitioners. And now, well, you know what the culture is. And it's just such an unfortunate construct, and it's been pushed on to the public education system so that we're caught in a vice that causes us to engage in a process that continually does this autopsy version of, at the end of every year, we look to see in the standardized test scores, we failed another cohort of kids. We didn't close the achievement gap. We haven't moved the needle in 20 years. And we'll just do it again next year. And at the end of the year, we look again. And I think we need to find a way to say, stop that for a minute. And let's pay attention to the inputs. And let's look at which children are enrolled in the GT, the honors, the STEM courses, who gets to be in band. To be in band, for example, in most places here in my state, you need a parent who's home in the morning and who can drive you in beforehand so that you can be part of the band practice, and you need to be able to buy or rent an instrument. And so they get weeded out of these opportunities from the get-go. And they're the same ones who are overrepresented in the out-of-school discipline. And they're the same ones who you could triangulate with the achievement gap data. And we know all this, but we are forced, our attention and our resources are forced to focus on that end summative assessment instead of on the inputs that would actually make a difference while we still have them in front of us. And so we're eager to change that culture.
Well, net result, the majority of people in the United States don't have a college degree, right? May or may not be necessary, but if you would rate us on a scale of 1 to 4 on how we're doing on the pandemic handling, I don't think it falls on the scale, right? If you look at how we're doing on climate change, if you're looking at how we're doing on managing social change, if you're looking at all these different scales, we're clearly doing badly, but we're not the only ones who are doing badly. We're doing badly all over the world. Now, I have to look at that and say, well, why could that be? Is it that we really are two different types of people in the world, the smart ones and the stupid ones? That seems unlikely to me. There's got to be something else happening, and education seems to be an important tool in changing that. Now, let me rev it up. We are in probably the most dangerous period of human existence that we've ever had, because we've built, for all the reasons that I think we all know very well, habitat and burning rainforests and all those other things. So it's possible that this generation that we are training now are going to make the decisions that determine whether or not life on Earth continues. It would be good if we were training them to do that. Having been in and out of schools all over the world and talking to kids, I'm not feeling like the kids are the problem. I'm feeling that school is the problem. We're just not getting it right yet. And that's what I'm spending a lot of my time doing, is trying to figure out, well, what would the parameters be? Well, one of the things that I would do is I would make sure every kid is exercising several times a day, strength, fitness, flexibility, and cardio all the time, because you learn better. Your brain is better attached to the material. You're more creative, you're more cooperative, and all those things if you are routinely exercising. I cannot write unless I take a walk first. There's a reason for that. And the reason is not a mood. The reason is that's how your brain is wired. We are so far away from that. There is no place for most kids to take a walk, and they certainly wouldn't be allowed to if there was help. We're so disconnected. And you guys are the boss of school, so you should be able to fix it.
We're on it. We really are. I'm telling you, I think, as I was saying earlier, we're trying to give our teachers and our school leaders and our school board members the I guess, the pre-forgiveness to not be chasing the test scores. We're kind of like, we're opting out. If we have to do it, we have to do it and get the money from the federal government. We might have to do something like that, but we're not going to pay attention to it. Zillow will, the business community will, because they need the number to show somebody. And that's unfortunate, but we're going to talk about it enough until they're ready to say, yes, we are going to get those kids out of the classroom, running around so that their brains create BDNF, that brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is like miracle grow, popping dendrites, ready to learn. We're going to do those things. We're going to do interdisciplinary learning. And we have just come off of this awful roller coaster of proficiency, or what's called competency-based learning, where you have to break down into silos every separate content area and then measure each little tiny piece of each standard, rather than having kids learn in ways that they will use knowledge later in life. Nobody's ever going to, as an adult, go down the hall and do some math and then go down another hall and engage in literacy activity. We do these things all together holistically. So we're trying to change our entire approach to involve interdisciplinary, project-based, collaborative, exciting, active learning.
Are you feeling as though, because you guys, I mean, I'm kidding around about boss of the state, but I just looked it up. It's 8% that the federal government contributes, 8%. So if you were to simply say, thanks, no, we're not going to do that, and you had the control, could you redesign it?
Yes.
And what, I mean, that's a big yes, Randy.
No, and the three people that you have on here represent states where it can be done. I don't know if you can change Texas, California, New York, big states. I'm seriously, because you're managing such large, but in the smaller states, I like to joke, we're all 1 degree separated in Kansas, right? If we're not related, we know someone that is, and I've grown up here. So just like Pender, she'd say the same thing about Maine. We know each other. We can do this work, but we have to agree on what the work is.
What's the work?
The work, that's the dilemma. It's convincing parents that what they say they want, they will allow us to do in school. And we've got, in 2 years, we've got 67 school districts of our 286 and over 170 schools that we have given total autonomy to hit these large scale outcomes: civic engagement, social emotional work of, that interpersonal, cognitive skills are all equally important. And they're going about it different with parents hand in hand, and then noting where they run up against the ceiling of, our parents won't let us change that much. And then we're trying to scale that in the state. And I think a state like all of ours here today, we have an opportunity to get that right if, and I think this is the big if, I don't have any other aspirations other than what I'm doing now. I'm not going to go somewhere else. This takes a decade to change, and the political winds want to change things in 6 months to 8 months. We've got to stay a course that allows us to change and not simply try to pop something that's artificial to look good. So I think we've got a chance, and there's great work going on in these 3 states and in some other, what I would call smaller population states. And that's not to knock California, but their challenges are just so much different.
They're huge too, right? So what about, let's get to a specific topic. Let's pick something that kids learn that maybe might work out differently. One of my favorites is Manifest Destiny. It's just this great mythological, crazy cowboys and Indians and all this other stuff that really doesn't have much to do with reality. It's a very complicated story. So you have robber barons and banks and military and diseased blankets and all these other crazy things that we've done, with the distinct goal to eradicate people whose land this was. And we used every trick in the book to try to teach that in a uniform, thoughtful way is really hard, because so much of this is based upon good old-fashioned American mythology. It's the legend that built our country. But as I looked into, for example, cowboys and Indians, they really weren't at the same place at the same time. It was really cowboys and army folks. And I think probably, Randy, you were probably closest to the action there. I don't think a lot of it was happening in Maine, but some of it might have been. So how do you teach that, Randy? And how does that fit in? Because that's a good, solid American curriculum. Everybody kind of touches it. So what do you do with that?
Again, you have to have agreement on what it is that you want to do with that topic. I mean, think about this. It wasn't until this year that Indians, right, Native Americans, got enough political clout to change the nation's capital mascot football team.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
We wouldn't have allowed that to go on with African American or Hispanic, but finally we had enough. There was enough political clout to do that. So as we talk about, we're gonna study Thanksgiving in a certain way, for example, that really didn't happen in that way.
Mhm.
But we're gonna, you have to have agreement on what history is and looks like, and that's challenging. That again comes down to, we don't have agreement across this country on what kids should learn and want, unless you go have a roundtable with adults to talk about successful adults, and they will all come in agreement until they get down to the details, Howard. And so it's hard. These jobs are hard because the political winds shift and change all the time and just swing you back and forth.
So go ahead, please.
Teach them how to think. Teach them how to think critically. Teach them any analogous type of situation and have them practice running these. I mean, I think it's really about teaching critical thinking and then presenting them, throughout. It's not about teaching a topic. It's about, at this point, they need to learn how to learn. They need to know how to discern true. We all need a primer, I think, at this point, in discerning what is true, what is in front of us. Is it true? Where did it come from? Can you vet the source? Those types of skills are really important. And having kids weigh the risks and benefits, the pros and cons, all of those things. And also have them examine how things interrelate, how an oil tanker out at sea and your little brother at home have something in common, forced metaphors, and that can bring in bigger topics. I think that's where we need to be working with kids, and little kids can do that. Like, how is this lesson like a shoe? They'll come up with a million ways. Those create amazing synaptic connections so that later they're able to apply, I think, these thought processes to bigger realities.
I want to drill down a little more, but Heather, jump in, please.
I think that's exactly right, Pender, because, what I might say is maybe we don't teach manifest destiny, and maybe that's okay. So maybe it's less about the content that you're actually teaching in school and more about what we would call transferable skills. And a lot of those are what Pender was talking about. So critical thinking, all kinds of ways of doing problem solving that's applied, not just rote memorization. So I think that's one of the pieces that's really critical, because back to an earlier question that you asked, Howard, it's impossible to ask our education systems or adults as parents, for instance, to somehow prognosticate, forecast what exactly our students are going to need 20 years from now. The pace of technological change and innovation is too fast. So what we have to actually focus on is helping them to be flexible, to be ready, to think critically, to know how to be entrepreneurial for some of our students. And it is far less about regurgitating facts and figures, regardless of whether we actually agree on what those are, Randy, which is an important point. But it's much more about giving them the tools and skills so that they'll be adaptable and really, that's the way they're going to need to be.
So here's, go ahead.
How do we measure that, right? How do we then measure this complex critical thinking kids' growth? How do we measure that in a way that pleases the realtors who are trying to say, this is a C+ community here, where you want to buy your house because they need a score, and that's the thing that's driving it up. But I say we have to actually, we're like morally compelled, I think, to put that in the box it belongs in. Maybe an 8%. Thank you for checking that out, because actually I never had done that math. The 8% box, put it over here, and now let's turn our attention to what matters. I like that idea, to compartmentalize what
I
is.
think
Well,
so
Pender,
too.
you and I disagree a little bit on this, because we've had lots of conversations
I
about
know.
this. But I do find some value in summative assessment, because I think if we're doing our job, you should see some improvement over time, regardless of how you measure it. And so would I agree with Pender that it is absolutely the case that we over prioritize those summative assessments? Absolutely. But I'm not willing to actually throw the baby out with the bathwater yet, but she's working for me.
I'm going to throw the
I'm
baby out with the bathwater now, big time. Let me try this on you. So let's go back to manifest destiny for a second. It's a little touchy subject. Now, if my family made money in the railroads, I think manifest destiny was brilliant. But if my family died because there's Native American blood, that's a very different story I'm going to tell. Well, it turns out that there really isn't one story. There's everybody's version of that story, some of which are going to contain some mythology, some beliefs, some family background, some heritage, some economics. And as I started going down the road of, well, maybe manifest destiny is a funny example, it turns out it's not. It turns out that almost every subject that I was able to, and I went through a lot of different subjects, all of them have different ideas attached to them. And it depends on who you are, what your background is, what your beliefs are. There isn't one way to look at it. But for school, and particularly for assessment, there needs to be, because you have to test it. Well, I don't think that's the way we learn. When I learn about manifest destiny, I don't stay on the manifest destiny trail. I go, that's really interesting. I didn't know there were that many railroads. And then we took them apart. What happened to the railroads? Oh, the car companies decided they wanted a car culture, so they destroyed the railroad industry and the trolley car industry and all that. We had the best railroad system in the world in the United States. We don't anymore. Why not? Well, what's this Amtrak thing? And by the time I'm done, I've studied 30 different subjects, but my 30 subjects are going to be different from Randy's 30 subjects, which are going to be different from Pender, which are going to be different from Heather. So if we're doing that, I don't think you assess at all. I think you've got a lot of people learning a lot of different things, which feels to me like the 21st century. I don't think we have all the people doing the same things, which ends up being the 20th century. I think the only shot we have at making a mark in the 21st century is to really pump up individual learning and figure out how to organize that. Is that a radical idea?
I don't think no, I think we're all trying to personalize the journey. That's what we're trying to do. And you can't do that by keeping kids lock, step, and barrel in an age, content system. Where I think I think is radical, Howard, is you almost alluded, well, you did say it's not measurable. I don't think most people in this country would say, I'm ready to go there. I need to have some indication that my investment in that product, whether it's at the state, local, or federal level, is working. And therefore, there has to be some measurement. I think most people we've gotten ever since the 80s, and I just don't think we're ready to go back on that and say, well, if the teacher said that they learned it, I'm okay with that. There's not enough people in our state would give me that much latitude. So we're trying to do what you said, but we're trying to layer on, how do you measure that? So we can say to people, we're measuring what you've asked us to do, and it's complicated, it's messy, it's not a one digit, and it doesn't make for a C+, on Zillow, and we're making some inroads there. But at least in our state, our parents are not, and business leaders are not ready to say, we don't care that you measure it.
Okay, Pender.
So I think measuring growth and measuring achievement might be an important thing, but I think the way we would do it, could we not consider a performance demonstrations. Those, I think I'm talking about when you said, actually, I was concerned, Randy, because you're right about this. The town and the business community is not going to believe you or take you at your word when a teacher says they learned it, or the kid even says they learned it. But if you take a published assessment, and I'm sorry, I just have to take a tiny bird walk here, not one of the ones we use in our states have ever passed the full on validity and reliability thing. So something that was externally created by non-educators likely, who put together this assessment instrument, because it spits out a graph, and we are crazy for data, and that is why it somehow is imbued with really false importance. Even the NAEP assessment, and that's an interesting and not so bad one, in my opinion. It's been around for, I don't know, 20 years, whatever it is. NAEP compares state to state, and I think its purpose is terrible. But the instrument, you would think by now, would have passed finally the validity and reliability test. And just this past year, it was announced that once again, with all the teams of, meta-analyses that have been done, it's not valid, nor is it reliable. But it's something. It's a measure. It's not like data is terrible, but when we're chasing that, and that's our goal, that the assessment instrument has gained incredible power over the trusted, brilliant, creative teacher, power over what the parent can see in their own child, or what the boss or the employment person sees in the kid. Those things are almost not real because you can't put them on a graph, but we are trusting these assessments so much. I feel like as you know, I know Heather, I actually suggested Heather with this because I was like, she and we have in fun contexts gone, and I couldn't respect and love you more. So I'm so happy to see you. But but I just feel like we have, and you know what the problem is? Alternative educator. I worked with all the failing kids, the most at-risk kids in the state of Maine for years and years, 2 decades of my career. I got to watch the wave crash over all my colleagues in public education from the safe vantage point of the one teacher who worked with the naughty kids, and therefore everybody left me alone, and I could kind of do what I wanted. And I continued. I did embrace standards, and I used the standards to build out these huge multidisciplinary project-based. The kids were working in the community. We had a unit called World Peace every year, and the kids would work together, and they would study war. They would study all over the globe where it happened and what were the critical things. If you have this and this and this, a war could probably break out. I mean, they really were doing critical thinking. They could apply that anywhere in a future that's better. And these were kids that were in and out of, the juvenile justice system. And I had that luxury of being safe from, in the early 2000s, when the culture of accountability, as they called it, is finally we're going to hold these schools accountable, and we're going to make them compete, because once they see they're failing, they're going to want to try hard for change, which was just awful. It was just sad. And then to see, if you were failing, something was created by people who had very little to do with you, your kids, your community, and was handed to you to implement. But I didn't have to, because I was taking those other kids. And so I had this very unique, I watched it happen. My husband's a teacher. I saw him go through it as a science teacher who used to do the most awesome, creative, cool things. And then he's now really boxed. He's down. He's got to be at a certain date. He needs to have certain content into their noggins so that, and it's been brutal to public education. And I don't know.
I wonder what I will remember. It's great that we're pouring all this teaching into the mill. I don't remember much of that. I remember what I learned. I remember the special things. I remember when the space chutes were going up, that we turned the entire classroom into a command center and tracked every bit of every flight. I remember those things because the teacher made an effort to make us a part of it. I vaguely remember learning about friction because I lost the notes, and it became a sort of a thing where my friends would tease me saying they had the notes and they actually didn't have the notes. But in terms of learning about friction, I'm pretty sure I did that by reading a book. I'm not sure that all of this attempt to teach me really had much adherence in my life. I feel like most of what I've learned, I probably learned because I wanted to learn it, not because somebody else wanted me to learn it. Heather, help.
Yeah, well, I think an important piece to consider there is that not all students learn the same way. So, some students are, they really benefit, just to throw the CTE piece out again, because for
What is
them,
CTE?
it's really about this hands-on career tech ed.
Thank you.
It's really about the hands-on. That's actually how they learn best. That's how they encode and remember the information. But I also, I think this is the dilemma of teaching. Your charge is to somehow figure out what it takes for each student in your class to actually best grasp and understand and master this material, whether it's principles that you're trying to get them to master, which is where I think we should be at, or it's a series of, really specific content pieces. So, and I think we have to be really careful, because that differs across courses as well. So, in math and geometry, it's probably fairly certain that there are some laws that students probably would need to learn and then apply those. But there's such a breadth of information in something like history. How could you possibly force students to learn all of that?
Well,
So,
let's talk about the Pythagorean theorem here for a second. I can recite it to you. I have had a more varied career than almost anybody I've ever met. I have never used it. If I want to know what that angle is, I'll take a protractor, I'll measure it. Or better, I'll hire a professional who will know what to do. So why did you teach me the Pythagorean theorem? And you know that there's a long list, of course, but the idea that there is this standard curriculum that we all must learn. I'm big on everybody should know what a stop sign is and what it does, because we know that the highest number of deaths in a community is going to be, for kids, is going to be cars or trucks, accidents. What else do we need to know? If I'm in New Mexico, which is the highest percentage of Spanish speakers in the country, but it's only 25%, should I learn Spanish? And if so, should I not learn the native languages, which are less than 5%? Are they not important? How does that work? How do we think about what we need to know? And does the state prescribe that? Because I think it does, but maybe I'm wrong.
Well, I think you need to think about you chunking it a little bit. So if you think about birth, and I think about now that a lot, I just became a grandfather for the first time.
Hey, congratulations.
3.5 weeks ago. So
Good
from
for you.
birth to about age 9, you're talking about developing skills that then you can use later on. You've got to teach people to read, and you've got to teach the concept of base 10 system and how numbers work. And you've got to teach inquiry based, type science, and how to play and get along with people, and all those. That's much different than what we're then. From about age 9 to about age 16, you've got to apply that learning over and over and over in as many situations as you can, so that you start to develop, I can apply this even when I come up against something I've never experienced. And then I think the 16 to 20-year-old is your transition into young adulthood. And so I don't know, Howard, I think when you say, well, it doesn't matter what I learn, I think it does if you're a kindergartner or a 4-year-old. I think there are some phonemic awareness, some rhyming. I think there's some very specific things I do want you to learn. That's different than if you're a 12-year-old. I think, and that's certainly different than if I'm 16 or 20. So
is there 10,000 hours worth of stuff I need to learn?
Maybe, if that's what you want to do. If you want to be Tiger Woods, or you want to be Mozart, or you want to be really skilled.
I'm not talking about mastery. I'm talking about the number of hours that I'm spending in school.
Oh.
I'm talking about the number of instructional hours. 20 hours a week, 40 weeks a year, that's 800 times 12 or 13, depending on whether you include kindergarten, it's 10,000. So seriously, there's 10,000 hours of that stuff? I don't think there is. I think there's 2,000, maybe 1,500. And then after that, I want to chase what I care about, because I'll learn it.
I agree with you, but I don't think you chased that at age 4.
I think I did.
Really?
And I don't think
Okay.
I was special. I think I was just interested in rocks. So I'd pick up rocks, I'd crack them open, and I'd figure out that they were different from one another. They were different colors, they sparkled in different ways. And then I'd go to the library and I'd find some basic book about rocks and be like, librarian would say, see, they're different. And I was like, feldspar. Okay. So I kind of learned. I mean, that's how I learned, by discovering stuff. I think all kids learn that way. I think you go out and you crack some rocks.
Except
Pick
I
a
don't
hobby.
think you learn how to read by discovering it.
No, I think you're right. I think you're right. I think reading and writing, which I think is critical thinking using ink or keyboard, and numeracy. I think those are the three that aren't quite school subjects. They're really skills,
Yes,
right?
to
Once
some
you,
level. But until
yeah,
you get to college algebra, it's the same thing as what you were talking about.
yeah,
I joke with my math friends. How often do I use college algebra? Like never.
right.
I never. I mean, I play with numbers in my head, but that's different to me than if I'm thinking about a 5-year-old and doing a sequence of what does it take to make sure that they know how to read.
Yeah.
I'm still going to let them. I still believe in the play and discovery and all that,
So
but
how
there's
much
still got to be
time,
some skill work.
how much time that you could have put into another part of your life did you spend learning algebra? Because if you're not using it, was there something you would have rather learned? Seriously, like in your life at that time, what would you have wanted to know in
Yeah,
depth?
for me,
Howard, as I
Yeah.
hear you talk,
yeah.
that
Go ahead.
question.
No,
Oh, I
go
was just
Pender.
saying, I am with you 100%. With all these, I couldn't be more on board with what where you're going. Except I would point out one of the cool things that school provides, public education, is you learn how to sit through something together. You learned how to hear somebody drone about something and you learned some self-soothing, and you learned how to daydream, and you learned how to write funny notes to your friends. You know you did, because I know that I did too. Like, I'm not saying that should be the be all end all of school, but there's never, I feel like the bigness of it. I have friends I have the most brilliant friends that I know, a few of them, I hate to say this, they went to Waldorf schools, and their kids go to Waldorf schools. Guess when they learned how to read? I hear it. And I know I've been to the conference where you learn that if you're in third grade and you're still at a first grade reading level, they're building your jail cells in the city planning office of large cities, right? And so
Yeah.
I get that heartbeat, got to get the reading into them. They learn to read when they're in like 7th grade in Waldorf.
Mm-hmm.
They play with rocks.
Mm-hmm.
They like it's not like we can all be a big. This is the problem. We are doing something at such a scale. The Waldorf children are super coddled across the board and at home, and it's a tiny setting of very privileged humans in a big diverse school system. I think that in part drives how we do have to do some of the same things. Can we relax a little? We could relax a little. Teachers could relax a little and re-embrace that thing that they were really passionate about back in the day. If principals felt like, whew, we don't have to be at this place in this, through this, like you can plot your trajectory, because it isn't usually the content, it is usually the skills and the thinking and the doing of things together, and to sustain our way through fun activities and through less favorable activities. Like all of that's important. And I think it's interesting to enumerate the hours and think probably we could have condensed the learning of skills into a smaller portion and had a lot more fun at school. Everybody could have breathed a little sigh of relief. And in fact, I mean, I don't know if you guys noticed, but the NWEA assessments just showed that there wasn't a giant learning loss. There was a marginal math loss.
Literacy. There was.
No,
For math.
yeah, it was
Yeah.
a small math
And,
loss, but reading.
and they couldn't find 25% of the kids to test them.
No.
I know.
So
Well, and they were predictably the kids who are the achievement gap kids. So who knows? But
Yeah.
it's interesting to think how I know I was assistant superintendent of a school district where when we scored a certain way as a state, we were 53% proficient in our whatever goals. All of a sudden there was this requirement that there was 90 minutes of literacy and 90 minutes of math for every elementary school kid, which really interfered with the fun and the free play and the other, cool things. And it was just that somehow 90 minutes was put out there by some consultant as being, that's what you need to be
Got it.
doing. And it's
Heather, how
so
crazy are we?
complicated.
Pardon me?
How crazy are we with this conversation?
Well, I don't think we're crazy. I think we're thinking outside the box and actually thinking about thinking innovatively, and I think that's great. But one of the things that we're forgetting, I would say, is that schools also, and Pender touched on this, schools are not just about what are you learning at school. So we learned this. So schools are an institution in their communities. Schools are a place that allow parents to actually work. So what we learned in COVID, for instance, is what you're doing with schools is going to have a massive impact on what happens in the workforce place and around this pandemic. And we in our state, had a couple of, slips with that where we had to really better coordinate. Okay, so we've got to stand up some childcare here. And I'm not saying that is a good or bad thing about how our society is set up. It is just factual at this point. And so if you wanted to think about every kid having like a Waldorf or Montessori education system, we have some real serious soul searching as a society to do. It is not just about we change schools and therefore we march on. I mean, a true approach that is 100% personalized, as you're talking about, that really blows out some of the, many of us would argue necessary, or at least, certainly traditional guardrails of the time that school is open, let's just say. It would be a fascinating conversation to see if we could do that somewhere. I just don't know, to echo what Randy said, I don't know if that would be well received across, the nation. It has an impact on other aspects of our society. Having said that, though, I believe all three of us as state leaders are not supportive or not certainly promoting what would be considered the old sort of Carnegie units, which is how you framed the original part of your conversation, which is, we are not, we're more interested in what is happening during those hours than what the hours are. And so I think that's relatively novel in the past decade of thinking about that. And maybe it's what we can do until we actually can, figure out a way to actually blow up the entire societal boundaries that we have.
So where does community fit into this? Because school is, you bring up a really interesting point. So the structure, not only in the United States, but almost everywhere, you go into a community, there's some form of a fire department, and there's a school. There's always a school. Sometimes it's a medical facility, but it might not be in that town. But for the most part, if you go into a place that has any population at all, there's going to be a school. And 3/4 of the people who work at that school are going to be female, and about half of those people are going to be very local, right? So we've developed this structure, and there's nothing else like it. I mean, maybe a gas station, but it doesn't really fit into this. And all of them do more or less the same thing. My wife works at a school library, and I'm off in Bulgaria, and I'm taking pictures of the Chromebook cart because it's the same cart that she has in her library, right? So the similarities are really striking. But the thing that really struck me about Eastern Kentucky and about this smaller village outside Stara Zagora in Bulgaria was the sense that the community and the school were one idea. There were people in and out of the school constantly. There were people, and students were very involved everywhere in the community. They were doing things. But that's not the experience that I had going to school. It's not the experience that my kids had going to a suburban school. And yet I read about and see sometimes schools feeding the local community way beyond breakfast and lunches just for students. I see them providing microloans and health services and all that. So what is the role here? And is that something that you think moves in a direction that helps to complete the circle? Or do you feel as though school is school and community is community? And if they interact a little bit, that's fine. But where does it fit? And you guys all have a lot of, rural communities in your area. So I would think it's more true in rural, but maybe it's just my, sort of storybook image.
No, I think in Kansas and probably all other states, because it is rural, um, they would say by and large, we're happy with our education in X until I get ready to take an ACT test and then apply college admission. And then you better have done something about that. So we don't, we could school choice. I always chuckle. Are you kidding me? In Kansas? I mean, the median school district size is 500. What's the choice? I homeschool, or I go to the only school that's there, right? I mean, so in Wichita, yes, in Johnson County, but most of Kansas, it doesn't matter. I don't have a choice unless I'm going to travel 20 miles to the next school. So most of our parents would say, I'm very happy if I can, if we can go have a football game on a Friday night where all the community comes out and we can have a soup supper in the winter, chili feed and eat cinnamon rolls. We think we're getting a great education till maybe toward the end, and then I want some measurement. That's not what our business community wants at all, but that's what parents, they're by and large, they're happy with their local schools.
That's
Fascinating.
so
Pender?
funny. There's a national poll every year that asks average Americans, what do you think of the public school system? And they say, it's terrible, it's awful, it's the worst. And then they say, what do you think about your local public school, the one that they have the most intimate knowledge? Oh, that school's awesome. Like they do all these cool things. And so there's this huge malaise that our schools are so terrible, but really people do love their local schools. And I think that the more the local rural schools are, it's so sad in Maine where we have this close down and consolidate culture around the failing school infrastructure. That is a thing that's happening, at least in the Northeast, to all of us. I mean, these are buildings that were built with cheap materials right after the war, and they are just like collapsing around us, and nobody has the funding to do very much about it. So they close and they consolidate into bigger schools so that the kids are traveling farther and farther. And those little towns that are dwindling in Maine, because we're losing population all the time, they're dwindling a little bit. Then you shut out the lights in the school, you put up a piece of plywood over the school in the corner of the little town, with that only has a gas station. What's the other thing? Fire department. And now there's a board over the window, and the rest of the town just is like the death knell of a community. And it's very sad, I think, to see. But then they consolidate and get bigger.
Howard, let me ask you a question. Would you agree with, I say this all the time. Everyone loves local control. See if you agree with this. Everyone loves local control until you don't.
Right.
Do you agree with that?
Boy.
If we build schools in your model, then you would like some control from us. But if not, if we choose a different model, you want local control. Would that be right?
Sort of. That's a great question. I think that life has changed. I think that students now have so many different options for learning, and yet they need structure. I'm putting my bet on the local teacher, and I'm going to assume we're going to hire the best possible teachers, and maybe we upgrade that and fix the ethnicities and all that other stuff. But to try to tell people at this stage of the game what they must know beyond that set of basic skills and some basic knowledge feels to me like a very long ago way of thinking. Similarly, test scores, whether they're for real estate or to help a college figure out who to take in, make that their problem. There are other ways of evaluating which group of people you want for what reason. So I think that we have to get back to learning, not school or education being the industry. Um, And I think it really has to come back to that school teacher-student relationship, and that's local. So when you're talking about local control, that local control for me happens in the classroom, not at the school district level. And if we pick the right teachers, everything Pender was talking about before, that's the education that I want our kids to have. And if we have to come up with a way to measure that along the way, we better have good reasons to do it. And college admissions is not a good enough reason, and real estate certainly isn't a good enough reason. So I think we have a lot of work to do. But with that, thank you for asking a good provocative question. We're going to wrap this up and roll the credits. But if you guys can hang out for another 5 minutes afterwards, we'll just kind of compare notes and see what we did. But Heather, Pender, Randy, this was actually one of the most exhilarating episodes we've done. It's been really fun. Thanks for playing along and allowing me to ask these kind of crazy questions and really participating. So much appreciated. We're going to do another program with school superintendents probably a little bit later in December, and we'll let you know, or commissioners or whatever it is you call you guys. But I'm really grateful. Thanks. And please hang on. We're going to roll the credits for just a few seconds. Thank you. For on-demand episodes and more, visit our website. Kids on Earth contains hundreds of video interviews with students from around the world. Learning Revolution is a global collaboration network for people who care about learning. Be sure to join us next Thursday for a new episode of Reinventing School. Thanks for watching.